I think we've got a great loading in here. Yeah, I want to welcome everybody to another edition of SEBA's Reader Meet Writer. I'm your host, Wiley Cash. We are very excited tonight to have Ed Tarkington with us. I'm the writer in residence at University of North Carolina, Asheville. I'm also the 2019 of SEBA's Pat Conroy Legacy Prize. And I want to tell you a little bit about SEBA before we begin. SEBA stands for the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance, and this is an organization that represents just under 700 independently owned bookstores throughout the Southeast. And perhaps one of those bookstores is the reason that you are here tonight. Perhaps you read Ed's book, you saw it advertised on their website, perhaps you got a Zoom link that brought you here to this event this evening. So please reward those bookstores by purchasing Ed's book and any other book that you are interested in from that store. They are the lifeblood of our literary community, and they are hurting just like all other small independently owned businesses are hurting during this time. And this time, the Corona time, the virus time, is one of the reasons we are doing events like this one. Normally, Ed would be staying in five-star hotels, being driven around in the backs of limousines, eating, steaks and drinking fine red wine out there on book tour. In reality, you'd probably be staying in a motel out on the interstate eating. But he can't do that. So he is here with us instead. So you could have been doing anything tonight, but you decided to devote some time to supporting authors like Ed and to sustaining this literary community that we've managed to build online. So I want to tell you a little bit about another event we have coming up next week. We'll be hosting Fatima Sheikh to discuss her book, Economy Hall, The Hidden History of a Free Black Brotherhood. This is a book set primarily in New Orleans. It's a nonfiction book about a Creole community that managed to weather racism, second-class, third-class citizenship that traces its evolution from the Haitian Revolution all the way up through the birth of jazz. It's really a story of community, a story of New Orleans, and by extension, a story of the nation. So please join us next Thursday night right here at this time, 7 p.m., February 25th. And then the following Thursday on March 4th at 7 p.m., we'll be hosting Kate Claiborne and discussing her new novel, Love at First Sight. But you are here tonight for Ed Tarkington and his new book, The Fortunate Ones, which is absolutely fantastic. So perhaps tonight during our event, our discussion, you may have a question for Ed. If you do not wait. Go down to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, hit the Q&A button and type your question in. And at the end of the show, I will ask Ed your question. Make sure you mention your name and the name of your home independent bookstore, because I would like to give them a shout out on the air. So it's not going to distract us. Just type your question in so you don't forget it. And I'll ask Ed your question at the end of the show. So tonight, I am really excited to host Ed Tarkington. His debut novel, Only Love Can Break Your Heart, was an ABA Indies Introduced selection, an Indie Next Pick, a Book of the Month Main Club selection, and a Southern Independent Booksellers Association bestseller. He's a regular contributor to chapter16.org, which is a literary organization in Tennessee. His articles, essays, and stories have appeared in a variety of publications, including Nashville Scene, Memphis Commercial Appeal, Knoxville News-Sentinel, Lit Hub. He lives in Nashville, Tennessee, and his new novel with this gorgeous cover is The Fortunate Ones. Ed, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Wiley, for having me, man. I'm so excited to be here with you, a writer I've admired for a really long time. It's really
I could say the same, and I didn't plan to say this, but you are one of those writers that I always think of. We had Ariel Lawhon on here a couple of weeks ago, I think last Tuesday, and who has always been very good at sustaining the literary community around you with Chapter 16 and all the literary scene in Nashville. So
thank you.
Kudos and my deep appreciation for keeping it going and keeping the lights on for so many of us. This is a book I was telling you in our green room that I heard about from your publisher long in advance of it being released. And it's a book that I was really looking forward to. And it's a great book. I really, really enjoyed it. And it's a relatively, it's not a slender book, contemporary novels, my new book is almost this exact same length. And it feels when you hold it like it's going to be a swift read. But this really is an old school sweeping saga, the chronicle of a life, the chronicle of friendships. You just managed to do it in a surprisingly slim amount of pages, but it feels very much like an old school romantic book that confronts a lot of powerful contemporary issues. So that being said, can you tell us a little bit about the novel and the story of Charlie Boykin as we get started?
Absolutely. Well, I'll start off by saying it did not start out as a slender book. All credit goes to my brilliant editor, Kathy Porres at Algonquin. She's a wonderful human being and a brilliant editor, and she really helped me take this kind of raw lump of clay and narrow it down into something that I am very proud of, and I want to make sure that she is properly credited for that. Charlie Boykin is a kid who is, the child of an unwed mother who ran away from home when she found out that she was pregnant, and her parents told her that she wasn't going to be allowed to keep the baby. And she ended up in Nashville, Tennessee in the late 1960s. And he grows up in a rough part of town. Most of his community is African American, and he stands out as a kind of a sore thumb there, but for the shepherding of his close friend Terrence, who kind of looks out for him. But then because of some incidents at school, his mother suddenly decides to take him and promote him to an independent school on the other side of the river, a private school. It's very Tony and exclusive and expensive and elite. And he ends up getting a need-based scholarship and comes under the wing of one of those sort of glamorous, sun-kissed, privileged kids named Arch Cray, who just seems to have it all, from the wealth and the privilege to the beauty and the brains, and all of the certainty that comes along with that kind of privilege. And Charlie just locks onto this kid like a lodestar. And the story that we follow is the story of their relationship. I should preface that by saying that at the outset of the novel, in the very first chapter, we meet Charlie. Charlie begins his narration as an adult after he and Arch have been estranged, and he's ended up in the Army as a veteran of the Iraq War. And while he's delivering a casualty notification to a family, the television is on and the news comes on and informs him that Arch has committed suicide. And so the shock of this discovery that this person with whom he was deeply involved and very much attached prompts him to then go back and tell us the story of how that relationship began and how it evolved leading up to that final break. And then finally, the aftermath of all that occurs because of that. And when Arch, when he learns this news, the reason it's on the news is because Arch has gone into a career in politics and become the U.S. Senator from Tennessee. And so what I envisioned here and what I hope has come across is I wanted to write a novel about love. I wanted to write a novel about class. I wanted to write a novel about the way politics work in the South. And I wanted to write a novel about how people who start out with good intentions and a sense of certainty that they're doing the right thing can very easily end up being led into conundrums that they cannot escape from and find themselves so compromised that they can no longer tell the difference between what's right and wrong.
Yeah, and very quickly, Charlie never necessarily falls under the hypnotic sway of social class or wealth, but he definitely gets swept up in the lifestyle of it. He is at least, he's kind of an agentless character. He doesn't make a lot of decisions for himself. But there are many ways and many examples of Charlie kind of looking around him and saying, oh my God, this is not the life that I know. This is a way of living that is so foreign to my own experience that it's like I'm standing on the surface of the moon. And I was wondering if you could talk just about a couple of examples that you remembered or specific examples, maybe like the Thanksgiving leftover party. And he's like, leftovers, or like the hunting camp. These things that are just kind of a matter of course, especially for Southerners of a certain social standing, that Charlie confronts or interacts with. Maybe just a couple of examples to give folks an idea of what he's up against.
Well, one of the things that I think I wanted to capture from the beginning is something that I've seen up close, which is that if you are born into the level of privilege that Arch is born into, it doesn't feel like privilege. It's just life. And you don't know any different. And people can tell you all day long that you're fortunate and that you're privileged and how, grateful you should be, but you don't have an experience of that from the other side. And in my job as an independent school teacher, I have seen that where, these boys who are very, very privileged, it's not that they don't care or they're not humble. It's that they just don't know any other way of living. But the kids who are on financial aid do. And when they get invited to a house on Bellmead Boulevard, that the front entry hall is bigger than any house they've ever lived in their life, and maybe an apartment, it's overwhelming. And I think that I kind of wanted to capture that. I wanted to illustrate that in the sense that the boys who go to schools like Yateman School that's described here in the novel just assume that that's normal and that that's what school is like for everybody. Whereas Charlie is a kid who's gone to an underfunded public school in, a really economically challenged neighborhood at a time. And Tennessee has never been particularly good to its public schools, but it certainly wasn't very good to them back in the 70s and 80s. And so you're going, it's light years between what people who, don't really, I can't even say take for granted. It's just all they know. Mm-hmm. And Charlie, on the other hand, has been in the complete opposite situation. Then he ends up, in this situation where, as you say, this, lavish party. It's like, oh, we're going to eat leftovers on the day after Thanksgiving. And it's like a, 200 person party with, just fabulous food and everything amazing. Or probably the episode that I was most interested in and that kind of was closest to me in my heart was when Charlie and Arch attend what is called the Tennessee Breeders' Cup horse race and go into these big kind of point-to-point fundraiser horse races where everybody dresses up like they're going to church and nobody actually goes to the track and watches a horse race. They just stand in these tailgates and get loaded in fancy Sunday clothes. It's just something that is totally unique to people of a certain class, the preppy class, the upper class. And it's dazzling, but in many ways it's also revolting. And my own, that whole scene was inspired by, the first time when I was in college, I went to the Carolina Cup in Camden, South Carolina, and it just blew my mind. On the one hand, I was like, this is really kind of dazzling and amazing. And on the other hand, I was sort of like, whoa, these people don't realize that this is just this feels like 1858 or something like that in a lot of ways. And I kind of wanted to illustrate how that particular pattern, to me, hasn't really changed. And of course, the events of the last year have proven to us that, the war is not over. It's still ongoing.
Sure. And I appreciate what you just said about people not necessarily realizing their class, and for them, it's just life. Mm-hmm. And, sometimes I feel like the books you read find a way of finding you like scripture. I was raised in the Baptist church, and the preacher would say, God laid it on my heart today. They woke up that morning and God was like, you need the scripture. And I think maybe now I needed this book because, I've been thinking and writing a lot about class, and what you just said, for them, it's just life. And, the tension in my life and in much of the things that I'm writing about, I just want to look around and say, like, are we going to talk about this? Is anybody going to bring this up? Like, this isn't normal. Nobody lives this way. But what you just said, for a lot of people, this is just life. And that's a very empathetic and a very true thing that I'd never thought about that clearly. So thank you. It brings a level of empathy to maybe the way that I'm thinking that I've been lacking in some ways. I want to discuss a little bit about the novel's connection to Gatsby. Mm-hmm. Arch is an orphan of sorts. Gatsby was an orphan of sorts. Mm-hmm. Arch's father has died. He's been left in the kind of the trust of his uncle, who's not really his uncle. And then Charlie, in some ways, is the Nick Carraway character. And but Archie is much more paternal than Gatsby is. And Archie is much more hand on the shoulder. You know, Gatsby's always calling Nick Sport, and Arch is always calling him, like, you know, Bud or Pal.
Bud, yeah.
Yeah, it's more intimate, you know. And much has been written in the past maybe half century or so about the homoerotic tensions between Gatsby and Nick, or maybe just Nick and Gatsby, and maybe even Daisy's wife. I think his name's Tom. His name's escaping me. But that is certainly here between Arch and Charlie. And I wonder what you were, you know, thinking in terms of Gatsby, in terms of maybe some of the critical landscape. You know, your background's in literary studies as well, like the critical landscape of that book and its bearing on your own book.
Well, I should start by saying that when I wrote this novel, I never thought once about The Great Gatsby. And that is the God's honest truth. I swear on my soul. It never occurred to me until I reached out to my friend Paula McLean to ask her if she would, you know, contribute some words to help promote the book. And she made that observation. And I was like, oh my gosh, it is true. I totally internalized this book. There's so much of it that is so transparently related to Gatsby. But in reality, I really was thinking very specifically about another novel that approaches some of the same subjects that is much less widely read and discussed, which is Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. And in that novel, the homoeroticism is much more explicit than it is in The Great Gatsby. And so it kind of got me thinking about that whole idea. And when I thought of Charlie, I really thought of Charlie as a person, you know, who was less entranced by the lifestyle per se, or by the wealth or the issues of class, than he is a lover of beauty. I wanted him to be an artist, which the narrator of Brideshead Revisited is also a painter. And so I thought, well, naturally, you know, that you know, and all this stuff that we read, classical literature, I've just been, you know, preparing to teach Death in Venice by Thomas Mann to my students. And that's really all about, you know, being in love with beauty at a time when, you know, in the classical ideal, male beauty in adolescence was sort of like the peak form of beauty. And, you know, for American readers, for 20th, 21st century readers, you know, what stands out about that is homoeroticism, but that's just sort of a normal thing for people back then. But I thought, okay, you know, what I really want to illustrate here is that intense love of an image, right? And I don't know that Charlie ever really understands or knows Arch as a person. He is in love with the image that Arch embodies. Arch is a work of art to him, a person who is on a pedestal and like a statue. And he would do anything for that, because that is his, you know, his highest aspiration. He's an aesthete, you know, he's an Epicurean. And what occurs because of that is a kind of, you know, seduction that is homoerotic and sexual, but not primarily sexual. It's more like, you know, what is the most complete way to possess or be possessed? And that's kind of how the human body understands that concept. In Gatsby, of course, I've studied that book, you know, and once Paula pointed that out to me, I was like, oh my God, this is like probably way more Gatsby than it is Brideshead Revisited. And I didn't really mean to do that, but I certainly, you know, it's an iconic book to me. I mean, once I sat down and I was like, I'm going to underline every perfect sentence in The Great Gatsby. And I stopped after like page 3, because I realized I'd have to underline the whole book, you know? But I was always really attracted to that idea, because it's the same thing. Fitzgerald's genius is this balance of using these characters as symbols, but also giving them this kind of incredible depth and humanity. And the ways that they understand each other are pretty superficial, but Nick has sort of a simultaneous, you know, sense of allure or being enamored by these things, but also sort of understanding that they aren't what they seem. And maybe that was what I inherited from that book more than anything else. But I thought that it was important to address, how completely someone will give themselves over, for something that they have really become obsessed with, and maybe obsession is the best way to describe it.
And I think obsession, and also, these two guys, Charlie is in the 9th grade when he goes to the school.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And Arch is in the 10th grade, but he's been held back, which is a thing that's new, in Charlie's social class, you get sent to school when you're 4 to kindergarten so your mom can go to work.
That's right.
But Arch went to school late, so he's in 10th grade, he's already got his driver's license.
Mm-hmm.
And not only does Arch offer a societal lifeline, it's also like a very existential lifeline. This is the boy who's going to shepherd me through school. Mm-hmm. This is my solace. This is my life preserver. So what becomes like a reliance then kind of leads to an obsession. Then you bring in Vanessa, who is the feminine ideal that Charlie kind of quickly latches onto emotionally. She's always just out of reach for him in a lot of ways. And so then the mother gets brought into the circumstance with the other family. I mean, there's all these different ways where it's not so much the net of fate as it is the tentacles of opportunity reaching down from the top and snatching up Charlie and his mom in very interesting ways. And then his mother's desirability becomes another ensnaring aspect of these relationships. It's very, very complicated. And that might be why I was referencing it earlier, is kind of, it feels like a big sweeping book. I mean, it feels like, idea-wise, I mean, it's Look Homeward Angel, it's Prince of Tides, it's a big idea book, it's a big Bildungsroman, big idea book, but it's very contemporary, and that's hard to do, and you did it. So I'm envious. So one thing I want to talk about, you mentioned the horse race. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about there are various dichotomies in the book, but the day of the horse race presents perhaps the largest. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about what Charlie had been doing that afternoon, and then what he does that evening, and what that evening kind of symbolizes in terms of cultural ideology, cultural identity?
Well, I mentioned earlier that when Charlie's growing up, his closest friend who lives across the hall from him in the apartment complex where they live is a boy named Terrence, who lives with his grandmother, whose name is Luella, who is a servant, a maid for wealthy families across the river, in the kind of homes that Charlie ends up being invited into when he starts hanging out with Arch and Vanessa. And that friendship, which was so crucial to him in his early years, kind of just sort of disappears once, Charlie, moves on up to the west side and starts hanging out with Arch and these other people who live, at a extravagantly higher standard of living. And on that particular day, however, for the first time in a long time, Charlie and his mother have gone back to where Charlie grew up in East Nashville to attend the funeral of Luella, Terrence's grandmother, who has passed away. And it's the first time that he's seen Terrence in a long time, and Terrence is kind of transformed, as is fairly common in the African American church. Terrence has felt the call to leadership in the church at a young age, and has become a kind of fiery lay preacher. And he gets up and speaks at his grandmother's funeral in a very commanding and charismatic way. And Charlie makes the observation when he's seeing Terrence, kind of in the full flower of his charisma and his eloquence, that all that really separates Terrence from a guy like Arch is, race, class, and socioeconomics. They are equals in terms of talent. In fact, Terrence might be more talented than Arch is, but there's a ceiling on what Terrence can achieve because, he's a Black guy from East Nashville who grew up in, impoverished circumstances in the 70s and 80s. whereas Arch has, been born with the proverbial silver spoon. And so Charlie gets a chance to reconnect with Terrence and kind of remember how important that relationship was to him. But by the end of the day, he's been picked up by Arch and has gone out to this, horse race, which is really all about a whole bunch of people getting dressed up to get drunk in a field, Confederate flags everywhere, people paying, African-American men to carry their coolers and stuff out to their various tailgate parties. In some cases, those coolers decorated with Confederate flags, just sort of symbols of this really intense, sharp, comfort with the status quo of, casual bigotry. And Charlie is suddenly kind of struck by, sort of how far he has fallen, that on the very same day that he was with his first best friend, who was poor and Black and who has just lost his grandmother, he's hanging out with a bunch of people in a field who have absolutely no problem with racial inequality, who drop the N-word any old time they feel like it, and who just feel genuinely superior. And yet he doesn't, throw it all down and leave. He's caught. It's too alluring to him. And I felt that was honest. And, people have compared me sometimes, and I take it, 6 days a week and twice on Sunday, to Pat Conroy. I'm very grateful for those comparisons. He was one of my first idols as a writer when I was a teenager. And he was one of the first people that made me think, boy, I really want to do this. But the thing about Pat Conroy's books is that, usually his heroes are kind of morally pure, they're usually on the right side of that particular argument. And that was something that was important to me, to help to enlighten me at a time when I needed it when I was growing up. But I just thought, man, most people are not like that. Most people are not pure. Most people will sell anybody out to get where they want to be and to feel that they are closer to the pinnacle. And that was the story that I wanted to tell. I didn't want to tell the story of the guy who took a stand. I wanted to tell the story of the guy who, let things slide and was willing to tolerate and even participate in things that he knew were wrong and that he knew were, against what was important to him and would hurt people that he loved, because he felt that was what he needed to do to stay in the circle that he wanted to be a part of, which I feel like that is kind of, I don't think that's an uncommon way to behave.
No, and this is a book of realism. I said it was a romantic novel, and I meant in terms of its sweeping scope, its ability to encapsulate life in a span of pages. But that kind of conflicted hero is much more realistic. I think it resonates, for today's contemporary reader, a lot. I think everybody wants to believe they're better than they are. And in those moments when they're standing around with all their bros at the Confederate flag tailgate, they realize they're not, but they don't have a ride home, right? That's kind of what it is. You're like, well, I'll stay, right? I don't have a ride home. And I'll save that bravery, that ethical bravery, for another day. But Charlie does do something, if not brave, very bold. He does. Halfway through the book, there's a moment where things change, and I'm not going to give away what that is. But even after that it's almost like he's been in a pressure cooker, and turning 18 and graduating, he suddenly realizes it and is like, man, I got to get out of here. But even after that break, and then years go by, he's still ensnared with this fealty to Arch and Vanessa, and he can't get out of it. And the back end of the book shows these two boys, now grown men, and the many ways in which Charlie becomes, duplicitous is a strong word, but ensnared in cultural, ideological, character inconsistencies. And there's a killer line where you write, Arch had become a man of the people when he runs for mayor. Yeah. And Charlie wonders, but the people shop at Walmart. Mm-hmm. right? So can you talk about that realization Charlie has there?
Well, I felt like before the break came, really what sort of triggered him was when, this is a guy who has no father, right? And so he's constantly looking for mentors. He's looking for somebody to tell him what to do. Uh, and I don't think that you necessarily have to have a father, but a lot of times, particularly in this really kind of, when we're talking about the 60s, 70s, and 80s, was a really kind of masculine idealization. Guys are looking around for somebody to lead them. And this particular teacher, who's kind of a mentor of his at the school, reminds him of this Latin proverb that he'd been taught, which is translated into truth is hidden, but nothing is more beautiful than the truth. And that's what really kind of makes him realize, my whole life right now is built around lies. It's built around a facade, but nothing is more beautiful than the truth. And the truth is that, he doesn't want to be a part of that, but he ends up adrift. And when Arch kind of throws that line out and starts to reel him back in, 10 years later, he can't resist, because he just feels that, this is where it's at. This is where power is. This is where beauty is. This is where authority is. And he says in that same paragraph that you referenced that Arch's gift was his certainty, his sense of certainty. And God knows, we've seen over the last few years in this country that if a powerful man gets up there and acts like he knows what's up and says, I am the only one that can fix it, 75 million people will believe him and follow him anywhere he leads. However, and this still astonishes me, those people, like you say, are the people who shop at Walmart. Those are the people who are on disability. Those are the people who, can't get a job because the factory closed down, and not because it's, gone to Mexico, but because it's being operated by robots. And yet, all it takes is a person who embodies what their idea of, the American dream is, which is, great success and great confidence. Confidence is what people want. And when you feel uncertain, which if there was anything I really wanted to get across with Charlie, is that this is a person who is deeply uncertain. Who am I? What am I supposed to want? Who am I supposed to be? Arch knows who he is. Arch knows what he wants, and Arch knows exactly who he's supposed to be. I'm just going to hitch my rope to his wagon and ride it wherever it goes, because I need to be with somebody who knows what to do. Yeah. And there's something kind of good about that. Just this understanding of we can't all be, captains and generals. Some of us have to be grunts and follow the leader. But there's also a sense in which if you don't have a sense of yourself and where your boundaries are, you can drift pretty far from where you want to be. And of course, that's where my story goes.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. We have some questions. I want to first start with a statement. Debbie, whose home bookstore is Oxford Exchange, she says, this is such an interesting conversation. I cannot wait to read your book. So we've done our work. Good night. We have Whitney Swinson. Shout out to Malaprops in Asheville. She cites the Gatsby connection, and she says, is there any connection to A Separate Peace? And I'll let you talk about that. That book is mentioned in your book, summer reading book. So can you talk about maybe that book's influence on you?
I name check A Separate Peace because it really is kind of, it was one of the first books that I ever read that, alerted me to the existence of such a thing as boarding school and private schools in general. And I also thought of it as being a book that revolves a lot around the concept of idealism. And make no mistake, my characters are morally flawed, but the institutions that they are a part of are legitimately idealistic, very much like our country. Like, we're flawed, but our institutions are idealistic. I mean, the principles that we have are idealistic. And I thought of A Separate Peace as being a pretty idealistic book, and its narrator as being a person who is pained by the fact that he feels that he's failed in some way to live up to the ideals, which were largely learned from his school. And he's a World War II guy, right? I mean, it's all sort of right in that kind of Greatest Generation vibe, and that got in the back of my head a little bit about how you can kind of be thinking that you're on that path, that, the institutions are instilling you with the right values and that you're part of something that's bigger than yourself. But there's such a fine line between, nobility and idealism and the good part of noblesse oblige and, just entitlement. And so I guess that's where it took me.
We have a question from Shanta. Her home bookstore is The Bookshelf in Thomasville, Georgia. I love them, she says. She writes, the book addresses racial issues in a very poignant, painful, and tender way. How did current events related to racial tension in our country impact how you wrote and edited this book? You did an excellent job of hitting an important nerve that deserves both quiet introspection, especially for those of us in the South, and broader cultural dissection.
That's a great question. And I'll try to answer briefly. Most of this book was written before things really blew up. And maybe I certainly was paying attention. I was very sensitive to this, both as a person who lives in an integrated neighborhood and as a person who sees how hard it is for young men of color coming into an independent school to navigate that incredibly, challenging experience. And I felt like, man, you cannot write a novel about class in the South without addressing systemic racism and socioeconomic inequality. But how do you do it? How do you do it? I at one point I thought, well, I really want to write a story about race and class, but that's not my story to tell. I'm not really, entitled to do that. Nobody's entitled to do anything, but it's not my place. How do I do it? And I really struggled with how to do it. And all I can hope is that it's done respectfully and thoughtfully and honestly. I wanted to be very straightforward about what I see and have observed in my lifetime, living through those decades, and also even in the present day with, how really, just unfair the world is based on this problem that we would all have liked to have felt had, been resolved by, the Civil Rights Act and the election of Barack Obama. And that's just not true. And I've not been grateful for the things that have happened that are tragic and terrible, but I have been grateful for what I have seen as being an enormous awakening amongst people like the people that I'm writing about, who just have no consciousness of what it's like to live, in a Black skin and have to deal with the kind of differences in experience and treatment that, just would never occur to them. I've seen it in my own family, in older members of my family who, are suddenly now, reading John Lewis and Letter from a Birmingham Jail, and they really want to get it right. And I think that's a really important thing. I didn't have any idea that the world would change as dramatically as it did. I mean, I was halfway done with this book when Trump was elected president, and I remember just thinking, like, I'm going to have to write another book. Like, what, politics has suddenly gotten way crazier than anything I was imagining in my head. But as it's turned out, I feel like the timing has been, fairly good for me. I'm certainly, I'm not, I'm no Orwell. I don't see the future, but I feel like things that I was noticing and thinking about are on people's minds right now. And I hope that the story unpacks those things in a way that helps them to see themselves and reflect on, where they are and how they feel about those issues in our culture, and that they're better for it. That's why I read.
Well, I'll leave us with this. That's a great spot to leave it. But I saw some early promotional materials of the book, and there was a tagline in the materials that said something about, why do the poor extend so much grace to the wealthy? It was a line like that. And that is what this book asks at its heart in many ways. So we had a couple of things come in at the end. Helen, shout out to Copperfish Books. She says she's buying this book. We've done it again. Courtney, Redwood City, California, home bookstore, Kepler's Books in Menlo Park. I really love this book and I so appreciate it. The theme that struck with her is the theme of being an outsider. So bring the outsider in, bring this book into your life. You will not regret it one bit. So thank you for everyone who left these great comments and questions. And Ed, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We had a lot of people join tonight, so it's a pleasure to see that and to keep it going. Join us next week, a week from tonight. We'll discuss the secret history of Creole New Orleans, tracing the evolution of a community, of a state, and of a country. So please join us for next week's book. It'll be a great discussion. So we will see you next week.